HB5 by Hunter relating to agreements to create jobs and to generate state and local tax revenue for the state.
The chair recognizes Mr. Hunter to explain the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, I want to give you time to file some more amendments. Just kidding. Members, let me give you just some general overview, and I want you to understand what this bill is, and I want to explain to you the procedure, because many of you may not have been through the process. First of all, HB5 is known as the Texas Economic Development Act. And I want to be upfront with you because I'm going to tell you some things that are in the bill and that are not. And so you know, you've been hearing about a word called 313. 313 does not exist anymore. It is out of the code. This is brand new legislation that has been being reviewed and being looked at. Now, Mr. Shine is going to work with me on giving you some process so you know how this will work. What I want you to know is that all of you have done a great job, and I want to compliment you because everybody I've talked to is engaged on this bill. And I think the House should be proud. Whether we agree or don't, this bill has actually gotten everybody engaged, and everybody has been very courteous. So let me give you some information about the bill. 1, 313 is gone. Adios, it's gone. When that word is used, that's old. 2, no renewables. Now, between us, I have no problems with the renewable industries, and I work with them. But in this bill, they are not. And it is not a negative message. It is basically a program so that we can get various groups on board. There is audits in this bill. You know, one of the things you've heard is there's no transparency, there's nobody looking at the money. This bill has built-in audit and transparency provisions. You also always hear corporate welfare. All this is economic development now between schools and businesses. And I want you to know what we're doing is competing no longer state, national, but worldwide. And we're now dealing in our area no longer with just local. We're dealing with companies like Samsung. We're dealing with people and groups like Tesla. So the concept is nothing that's out of the ordinary, and we're trying to shape this as a Texas program. And I do want to tell some of you who've had doubts. I agree with some of your doubts. I'm big on the transparency, and I'm big on the auditing. And I think you need to know about the money. But what we've done in this bill, and I see my good friend who's been chair of public ed, Mr. Dutton, Mr. Buckley, and you're aware of this because you and I are so young here, Mr. Dutton. And Chairman Thompson, this time we're uploading the money to the schools. This time you have a formula where the education community is getting the money up. You know, I talked to some of you on this side, and you were concerned because some of the data in 2021 was shown on the backside. This goes the other direction. You're going up front with the schools. Many of you are getting calls now, which is different, from school districts supporting this bill. And many of you are getting called by your chambers of commerce, some of your economic development groups. So I want you to know this is completely different in the formula. You know, I know Representative Morrison has Caterpillar. A lot of you have these companies, but what this bill is doing is merging more involvement between your schools and your businesses. Let me bring out some general points, and then I'll ask Mr. Shine to give you some process. This is basically going to be an economic development tool to continue to attract investments to Texas. On the transparency, and this was important, the economic benefit statement prepared by the applicant projects the full economic benefits of the project for 25 years. A school finance impact report prepared by the local school district will involve 25-year period. It also has prohibiting solicitation or acceptance of payments or transfer of property outside of the final written agreement. And it requires a detailed biennial compliance reporting by the applicant to the comptroller. It'll also involve the school district in some reporting, and the legislature has reporting, and it includes a review by the state auditor. It has a new job requirement, and each approved project must create, and it also has qualifying provisions, eligibility provisions, and it goes into various areas. I'm going to ask, Mr. Speaker, that Representative Shine come forward to give the process, and then we'll take some questions.
The chair recognizes Mr. Shine.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I want to quickly hit the highlights in each section that you have. And if you're looking at it, we should be, we'll have questions in a bit, we'll be able to go page number and line number. I'm going to take this as a section at a time, and there are actually 24 sections that we'll hit. A few of them will be rather quick, and a few of them might take a little bit more time. This is now section 403. That's what we call this Economic Incentive Act. And it's simply, section 403 states the purpose of the bill. When you get into section 403, 602, this is where we get into the definition section. And I want to point out one important definition that's part of this legislation. It's national or state projects or supply chain infrastructure. We're talking about grid reliability projects, new dispatchable generation, seawater or brackish groundwater desalination projects. In the next section, which is 403, 603, we actually have an expiration date, and we have December the 31st of 2036. This is a 12-year period, which is consistent with the sunset schedule for state agencies. In section 403, 604 is where we get into the statutory language of jobs and investment requirements. We actually double the jobs requirement from previous programs, 25 to 50 for highest job requirement categories. In section 403, 605, we describe the taxable value of projects in order to calculate the maintenance and the M&O payments to school districts under the agreement. We have 5 categories in this area, ranging from over $10 billion in property value to less than $100 million in property value. And we have that broken down in increments as well. In 403, 606, this addresses the application from the applicant to the school district. It must be on a form that is prescribed by the comptroller, which will include all the necessary information to meet the statutory requirements of the legislation. The application must include a fee to the school district for any administrative or professional services that are associated with the application. In 403-607, we address a requirement from the applicant to provide the school district and the comptroller with an economic benefit statement. And the criteria for this statement will be provided by the comptroller's office, as it intended to give a total economic impact snapshot of a project, its impact on the local community, and its impact on the state of Texas. In 403-608, this will require the school district to provide a school finance impact report, highlighting the projected tax and revenue consequences for the district of the proposed project. 403-609 addresses the criteria in the process for determination by the comptroller to recommend or to deny a project to the school district. In 403-610, this addresses the hearing process if the comptroller does not recommend a project. In 403-611, it outlines the timeline for processing the recommended application that comes from the comptroller's office. 403-612 addresses the parameters of the agreement under this chapter. The agreement will define the incentive period, the job, the investment requirements, and the provision allowing the school district to terminate the agreement if the applicant fails to meet material requirement. 403-613 specifies the incentive period, which is 10 years. And in 403-614, this is the section with the parameters that are provided for the incentive payments to the school districts. When we get into 403-615, this is the area where if there is a failure to comply with the jobs and wage requirements, it puts into statute a clawback. If the applicant fails to meet the jobs requirement in the agreement, this is the clawback provision. In 403-616, we have an audit requirement by the state auditor. In 403-617, we create a biennial review requirement by the applicant. And in 403-618, we require the school district to report the amount of incentive payments and how incentive payments are to be spent. 403-619, the comptroller has to report to the legislature. In 403-620, this places into the statute a conflict of interest provision as well. This ensures that consultants can only represent either the school district or the company, but not both simultaneously. In 403-621, this relates to how the incentive payment is received and how it's processed. In 403-622, this addresses the confidential and proprietary information that is in the application. And in 403-623, requires the comptroller to post on their website for transparency purposes an application which is within 10 days of receipt. And finally, 403-624 requires the comptroller to adopt the rules and the forms that are used in Chapter 403.
The chair recognizes Mr. Hunter.
Thank you. And Mr. Speaker, members, let me give you a little bit procedural because we're now into May, and I want you to pay attention to amendments. I know this is probably going to be surprising, but some of these amendments may be bills that didn't come out of people's committees. So be sure and watch the amendments. And I'll be accepting some amendments. It's not a no across the board. Some folks are actually drafting amendments right now, and we're considering. I'm not going to be asking for a table. Whoever does the amendment, if we oppose, they'll propose, and I'll oppose, just up and down. But I wanted you to know procedurally to be aware, and it's not unheard of. You're going to see some amendments that are folks' legislation, and I want you to be sure you're paying attention. Some will be challenged, some will be argued, but I want everybody aware how we're proceeding. And I think that'll be all our presentation, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Smithy, for what purpose?
Will the gentleman yield?
The gentleman yield for questions.
Which gentleman?
Well, Mr. Shine.
Okay, I yield.
Mr. Shine yields.
First of all, Mr. Shine, let me say thanks to both you and Chairman Hunter for the time and the effort that you all have put in on this legislation. Sitting near you, I know you've put your heart and soul into this, and on behalf of the House, we appreciate the time that you've spent doing this. So thank you very much. I have a question that Mr. Hunter suggested I ask you, and that it's kind of down in the weeds on the bill, but it is my understanding the bill defines both an eligible project and an eligible property. It's my understanding that in order to get tax treatment under this act, I would have to have both an eligible project and it would have to be built on an eligible property. Is that a correct understanding?
Mr. Smithy, that is correct.
Okay. So here's what I'm getting at. On an eligible project, it would include a national or state security project or a supply chain infrastructure project. That's on page 3 of the bill. And so, as I read the definition of a grid reliability project, which is included in that definition, it would be any project that generates base load or dispatchable electricity for the power grid. Do you follow me so far?
I do.
So an eligible project could include renewable energy if it could be certified as dispatchable. Is that correct?
I think that that's probably a definition that is not completely clear, okay? Dispatchable projects, as I understood the definition, would include battery storage, would include lots of areas in that arena, with the exception of alternative energy sources such as wind or solar.
Okay, but assuming that, and we're not there yet, but assuming that within 4 to 5 years, that we could have battery storage or air compression such that would make renewable energy dispatchable under the definition into the grid that we're using, would then a renewable project be an eligible project under this bill?
And actually, if it was provided for by this legislative body, you could probably plug that in without too much trouble.
Well, I mean, under the language in the bill now, it seems to me that if I can say that if I can certify some capacity of energy as being dispatchable, then it doesn't matter where it's coming from. It could be renewable, it could be carbon, it could be almost anything. But if it's dispatchable, then it would qualify as an eligible project.
That's correct.
Okay. Then we have the definition of an eligible property, which, as I read it, would take away, and that's on
Where is that at, sir?
That's on page 3 of the bill, line 16. An eligible property excludes any property used for intermittent power generation to supply electricity to the power grid. And so, to me, it looks like a potential conflict there, where I could have an eligible project, but even if it was an eligible project, it might not be built on an eligible property and therefore wouldn't qualify under the exemption. So, I mean, can you give me some clarification on that? And I'm sorry to hit you with this. Yeah, I should have talked to you about this before, but honestly, it just kind of came up at reading the bill.
If you'll look on page 3, under line 16(9), and you look at the sub A and I, this gets back to your question just a moment ago about projects constructed after the date of the agreement pertaining to the project that's entered into. It appears that it's possible for, as you mentioned, 4 to 5 years later, itself is not going to qualify in Chapter 403.
And I get that because we need dispatchable power. But honestly, we want dispatchable power from wherever we can get it, as far as I can tell. So I appreciate your clarification on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Smith.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Mr. Speaker,
Ms. Collier, for what purpose?
may I move to extend the time?
In just a moment, we need to have the clerk make an announcement.
Okay.
And we also need AV down here to fix the back microphone. So. The following announcement, the clerk read the announcement.
The Committee on General Investigating will meet today at 1:45 p.m. in room E1.026 in a formal meeting to consider committee business.
Chair recognizes Mr. Shine. Representative Collier, for what purpose?
Will the gentleman yield for questions?
Will the gentleman yield
I
for
yield.
questions?
I
The gentleman
yield.
will yield.
Thank you so much. Representative Shine, I just want to say, I want to thank you and Chair Hunter because I could tell after reading this bill that you took a lot of time to, an effort to come up with the provisions, and it's very detailed, so I appreciate the work that you've done on this. I do have a few clarifying questions that I'd like to ask you, and they start, and I'm going to refer to the bill analysis. You did that section by section, but I'm going to go to the bill analysis on page 2.
Okay, let me
that
get there.
Sure. And it talks about required jobs and investment. You there?
Getting there. Page 2?
Yes, sir.
Okay. All right, go ahead.
Okay, and for purposes of our discussion right now, I want to look at the first section that deals with the project with a taxable value of property of $10 billion or more for the tax year preceding the year in which the application is done. So I'm going to operate off of that section. And we understand taxable value is appraised value less exemptions. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay, so the question I have, it says if you have, under this section, if this is applicable to you, you have to create at least 50 required jobs. And in another portion of this section, it talks about construction jobs being eligible for this 50 required job obligation. So my question is, what is a construction
Construction jobs are going to be those jobs on site. They're going to be part of putting this project into creation. Any and everybody that's on site that's employed by the applicant that's being employed by them directly that's working this project is going to count as a construction job.
So what about the architect?
You asked me that question a moment ago, and I'll get you an answer on that one. I don't have an answer on that one yet.
Okay,
They're
engineer?
associated with the planning process and what have you, and I'll see if I can get you an answer before we get through with your questions.
Okay, what about the engineer?
Engineer would be part of the construction job.
Okay, and so I do see that you took time to say that you only get, for those 50 required jobs under this provision that we're looking at, you said that it has to be construction site, and if one of them can be construction site, but you can get credit for one required job for every 10 construction site jobs. Is that right?
That's correct, and those
Okay.
would be jobs that would be not directly on the site, but would be associated with the construction itself.
Okay, so perhaps the architect, the engineer?
Well, no, the architects, I just got an answer for you there. And architects are part of the labor charges, and architects are included into the construction job numbers.
Okay, so whenever you're doing construction work, there's a lot of things that go into it. Is it accurate to say that there is a potential that an applicant could reach their 50 required jobs during the construction phase?
Yes, absolutely. And I think in most cases, at least reviewing past performance of these projects, most of them have exceeded that, and some rather significantly.
Okay, but the 50 required jobs could be accomplished at the very beginning before they even start doing anything.
That's correct.
And so the next question I have deals with the $100 million investment under this section that I've referred to in the beginning, with the projects over $10 billion. The $100 million, I guess it's an investment. It's just saying that the property is worth $100 million, or how does that number come up?
That's what the $100 million is actually what they have to put in place in the project before the incentive even begins.
Is there money being exchanged?
And
What do you mean? What do you mean they have to put in? Like they have to, like, invest $100 million, and how? How would they do that?
they have to have an investment of material and costs associated with putting that material there of $100 million or more.
Okay, that was
Okay.
that was the question I was asking. All right, the next question I have, going back to those 50 required jobs, is the applicant required to create 50 new jobs every year, or they just have to maintain?
They have
50?
to maintain the 50 jobs each year.
Each year should
And
be.
obviously, in the early stages of the project, you will meet a certain job requirement, and as the project progresses, you're probably going to end up with a lot more than 50 jobs that'll be associated with the construction itself.
Right.
Most of the economic impact of the jobs and what we're talking about is going to be through the course of the construction period itself. And those construction periods could be anywhere from 3 to 4 years, could possibly be a little longer, not necessarily shorter than that.
But there's no obligation for the applicant to create more jobs if they meet the 50 required under the provision bill.
Ms. Collier, I think that would depend on the project itself if it would require them to have more employees.
No, I'm talking about the obligation, the commitments that they're making.
That's the obligation based on the matrix and the formula. That's correct.
Right, okay. So your answer is there's no requirement for them to create.
They're meeting. If they meet the 50 employee average, they have met the requirement on the matrix.
Is there a historically underutilized business provision in here that would encourage or require an applicant to utilize historically underutilized businesses to accomplish their work and their commitment to Texas?
You're talking about hub businesses?
Yes, sir.
There's not a requirement in the legislation to require hub businesses specifically, but I would think that we have a number of those businesses that are scattered around the state of Texas that are predominantly in construction or construction support type businesses. I believe it would depend on whether there was a business of that nature within the location of the project that would be able to bid on the project and participate.
Well, I mean, we're creating.
There's nothing that prohibits it.
Well, I'm glad, but since we're creating a new section, this would be something that would be helpful to include so that we can get those small, disadvantaged businesses the opportunity to also see the benefit that our school districts will see from the provisions of this bill. So that was one of my other questions.
Okay.
The next question I have deals with the jobs, the required jobs. So 3 to 4 years, we're done with construction, and I have to maintain the required number of jobs on average. So my first year I did 75, the second year I did 75, the next year I did 75. Would I be able to go down to 50, or do I have to do the average of 75?
If the requirement in your application and the agreement you have with the district is for 50 employees in the construction period, as long as you maintain that average through the construction period, you have met the requirement.
Could the school district increase that requirement?
I'm sorry?
I just want to see how much flexibility or how much leverage a school district has. Can they increase those 50 requires, or it's in statute and they cannot?
You know, based on the way it's outlined in the bill, there's an agreement between the school district and the applicant. And if the school district says in order to make the agreement work that they wanted a higher average of employees, they could certainly specify that in the agreement, and the applicant could either agree to that or say, no, we don't agree with that, and not pursue an agreement with them or a project.
And thank you for pointing that out, because the rule, according to the bill analysis, says at least
At least.
50 jobs. So if the school district decides that they want 100 jobs, they can make that request based on whatever the circumstances are in their community.
They can enter that in, they can make that part of their agreement process, and then the applicant can certainly choose to say yes or no and enter into an agreement or not enter into an agreement.
Well, thank you. And then the next question deals with virtual jobs. These jobs that are going to be created, I heard you say something about on-site. So the 50 jobs under our scenario that we're still working under the top tier, the 50 jobs must be in Texas on-site, not virtual.
That's correct. These are construction jobs on site. These are not
Well,
virtual
no, not
jobs.
construction.
I'm sorry?
Say, for instance, we're done with the construction period,
Well-
and now we're into the actual operation of the business. The 50 jobs that they have, can they be virtual or not virtual? Can we get that answer before you hit the gavel?
The gentleman's time has expired.
Mr. Speaker, I move to extend.
Members, this motion requires unanimous consent. Is there an objection? The chair hears an objection.
I didn't hear an objection. I did not hear one.
Members, was there an objection?
No. Can I get him to answer that one question, please?
They do not have to be on site.
All right. And then the next question I have, the application fee, the $60,000 application fee. Is that set in stone? Because it seems like it's very inclusive.
That is set in the statute on the $60,000 application fee, as well as the amendment fee that's set out in the statutes.
And I will say that I do appreciate the provision in there about the comptroller having to give a second look at the application to make sure that their statement about the economic benefit and the school district's impact statement has to be verified or at least reviewed by the comptroller for accuracy and veracity. And so I do appreciate that part, because if the comptroller does not believe that that statement is true, they can deny the application.
That's correct. And there
All right.
is a hearing process. If they do deny that, that would allow the applicant to pursue if they're denied.
All right, thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Collier.
Representative Schaefer, for what purpose?
Will the gentleman yield for some
Will
questions?
the gentleman yield for questions?
I yield.
The gentleman yields.
Thank you, Representative Shine. For your reference, I'm going to be looking at page 4 of the bill.
Page 4 on the bill?
Yes, sir.
Okay, hold on a second. Yes,
Members, please take your conversations outside the rail.
yes, Mr. Schaefer, go ahead.
Okay,
Page 4.
thank you, Mr. Shine. So, Section 11 talks about the grid reliability projects.
Correct.
And I think you and I both would agree that we've had some challenges with grid reliability in Texas. And would it be your preference that we add more thermal energy to our grid or more renewable energy to our grid?
You're asking me for an opinion?
Yes, sir.
My opinion is we should pursue all alternatives to provide to the grid.
Okay.
In this particular statute, in this legislation that we have, we do not look at the renewables in this legislation, and that is not specified in 403, Chapter 403 at all.
Is it your position that this bill does or does not benefit wind and solar?
There is no provision for wind or solar in the bill, so it does not provide for wind or solar.
So would you agree with this statement that this bill does not benefit wind and solar?
Not for new projects.
Okay. So let me go a little deeper with you on that. When I'm looking at Section 11, subparagraph A, it says that generates base load or dispatchable electricity for the power grid. Those are thermal type sources and nuclear. or that provides stored energy to the power grid from batteries, regardless of power source. Now, Mr. Shine, isn't it the case that this is referring primarily to wind and solar? Because wind and solar are the primary energy sources that would require batteries when the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining.
Well, in stored energy to the power grid from batteries, it says regardless, in the legislation it says regardless of the power source. I think the definition of dispatchables is probably, which I think Representative Collier was questioning earlier, needs maybe more clarity in its definition.
Okay, so would you be willing to take an amendment that ensures that the batteries projects are only for those from thermal sources?
Yeah, Mr. Schaefer, if you'll draft that amendment, bring it down, we'll look at it.
Okay, so let me ask you just a few more questions here. So I just want to make sure that I'm clear in my understanding. On lines 13 and 14, if the energy source is using batteries, it can come from wind and solar, correct? Because
It can, but
come from
batteries
any-
are source neutral.
So it can come from wind and solar.
It can come from any source because they're source neutral.
And we know, as a matter of practicality, wind and solar are the primary sources that would utilize batteries. Is that correct?
I am not advised if that's correct or not, but I do know that batteries are source neutral and that they could be used in all those cases.
And battery production is heavily subsidized. And the reason it's heavily subsidized by the federal government is that it benefits wind and solar projects. So my concern is if members think that wind and solar are not part of this bill, they really are, because batteries are integral to how wind and solar are going to be a part of the grid going forward. Would you agree with that?
I don't think batteries will equate to more wind or solar generation, since they are source neutral.
Well, but batteries are coming online for wind and solar because sometimes the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine. And, you know, when it's cold at night in the winter and we don't have any solar, these solar projects are looking at batteries. And this would allow those projects to come in place to benefit the solar panel projects. Would you agree with that?
Sounds reasonable.
Okay. Thank you for answering my questions.
You bet. Yes, sir. Okay.
Following amendment, the clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment by Shine.
The chair recognizes Representative Shine to explain the amendment.
Members, this amendment is a perfecting amendment. It has 5 different pieces to it. If you'll follow with me, the first part of the perfection is in regards to the NAIC date. And as stated in the Chapter 403, we have 2007, and we will substitute the year 2022 for the NAIC code. The second part of this amendment deals with the school finance impact report. The third section will deal with the application itself. The fourth part of the amendment deals with the indemnity clause that's contained in the legislation. And the last is the effective date, which is to be changed as well. So when you look at line 2, you will see the change from 2007 to substitute to 2022. You'll look at the school finance impact report on line 8, sub D. And then when you look at the application, you will be down on line 23. As you get into the indemnity, you're looking on the back on the second page, which would be line 3, and then the effective date would be down on line 21 and 22. It's a friendly amendment and I move adoption.
Representative Shine sends up an amendment. It is acceptable to the author. Is there any objection? Chair is none. The amendment is adopted. Following amendment, the clerk. Mr. Gates. Following amendment, the clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment by Gates.
Chair recognizes Representative Gates to explain the amendment.
Yes, this promotes the creation of a qualified workforce by providing and developing apprenticeship training programs, workplace education, in partnership with school districts, and acceptable to the author.
Representative Gates sends up an amendment. It is acceptable to the author. Is there any objection? Chair is none. The amendment is adopted. Mr. Rosenthal. Mr. Martinez Fisher. Following amendment, the clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment by Tenderholt.
Chair recognizes Representative Tinderholt to explain the amendment.
677.
Bear with me, members.
Yeah.
677. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, this body
Mr.
passed
Speaker.
Representative Zwiener, for what purpose?
I raise a point of order against further consideration of this amendment under Rule 11, Section 2.
Bring your point of order down front, Ms. Zwiener. Members, the amendment has been withdrawn. Following amendment, the clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment by Smithy.
The chair recognizes Representative Smithy to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. What this amendment is designed to do is to make sure that if we can come up with a renewable power source that is dispatchable, and that's the magic word. That's the problem with renewable right now. It's not dispatchable. We were talking about what dispatchable means. I don't have a definition for you, but Representative Darby probably said it better than anybody. He said, when you turn the switch, the power comes on. That's what dispatchable really means in very simple terms. We have not had a wind or solar project yet in the state of Texas that would qualify as dispatchable power or dispatchable electricity. But in the next 4 to 5 years, most people believe with the battery technology that's coming online and is being developed, that we will in fact be able to provide the storage of electricity that is produced intermittently so that we'll make that dispatchable. And if we can do that, then why would we discriminate against one power source against another? Why wouldn't we want power from every source possible? And so this would just prevent us from picking winners and losers and in terms of energy production, and it would permit, if that day ever comes, when we can use technology to use renewables. Now, this includes not just wind and solar, but for instance, Representative Clardy in his district has a biomass plant. Now, biomass is very close to being a sustainable and consistent source of power for dispatchable power. We're going to need power from everywhere we can get it on our grid. And so for that reason, I would ask you to approve this amendment.
Mr. Patterson, for what purpose?
Will the gentleman yield for questions?
Will the gentleman yield for questions? The gentleman will yield.
Mr. Smith, the biomass plant that you talked about over in East Texas, that is, I believe, owned by Austin Energy. Is that correct?
I really don't know. I just had the conversation with Mr. Clardy, and he's concerned that under the terms of the bill, plants like that might open in other parts of the state. And I have some of those in my district that use cow manure, honestly, and other forms of waste to produce energy.
Are you aware that biomass plant in East Texas provided 0 megawatts during the Winter Storm Uri event?
I don't know anything about it, but I know that we had a number of thermal plants and other sources that provided 0 energy during that period of time. We had failures among virtually all of our sources of electricity, of generation that we have out there.
Actually, most of the generation was natural gas fired during Winter Storm Uri. Are you aware that more than 60% of the megawatts that are in the queue for ERCOT already are intermittent resources, wind and solar, predominantly solar? So are you saying that we need to add more incentives for wind and solar for them to build in ERCOT?
Well, I'm saying this, that if the problem with wind and solar so far has been the intermittency, that although it has given us a power source, it has not been what we would consider or define as a dispatchable source. And I get that. We don't need any more power unless it's going to be available when we need it. And so all this amendment says, and basically, let me tell you where we are on the bill right now. A wind or solar project or any renewable project could fit into the definition of an eligible project, okay? But there's a question as to whether it would fit into the definition of an eligible property. And so, in a way, this amendment just clarifies this. Now, it's a policy decision this legislature is going to have to make. Do you want to pick a winner and a loser here? Or do we want to say whatever source of power we can get it from that will be sustainable and will also be dispatchable and dependable? We want that for our grid because we're going to need that. And
isn't it true that the federal government's already picking winners and losers when it comes to our energy resources? I mean, subsidies for natural gas are 39 cents for every $20 that wind power receives and $80 that solar receives. So the federal government's already picking winners and losers, and this bill would help alleviate that by providing some incentives for dispatchable generation resources and not wind and solar. Is that not true?
Well, I'm not sure our job is to level the playing field. What I want to do is to encourage the production of energy, because the more energy capacity we can get online, the better it is for Texas consumers. It ensures reliability, and it also helps cut the cost of the electricity to the ultimate consumer. And those renewable sources that we have out there now, primarily the wind, it has reduced the cost of electricity to the end user throughout the state of Texas, and that's a good thing.
I disagree. I mean, wind power breaks even at negative 2.5 cents per kilowatt hour. Is that true?
No. Wind I don't know if I understand your question, but I'm just telling you the cost per kilowatt hour is significantly less for renewables than it is for thermal.
But it depressed the market to such a degree that no one else would invest in our market, and therefore that's why no more dispatchable, no more thermal generation's been built in half a decade, basically, because they depressed the market to such a degree, which causes issues like what we had this past January and here and in Winter Storm Uri. Is that not correct?
You're talking about the past. I'm talking about the future. We've got to look to the future. We can't do anything about the past. But in the future, if we can create dependable, reliable, dispatchable energy from whatever source it might be, that's what we need to be doing. We need to put aside our special interest in what source we may prefer. And I'm of the opinion, all of the above. When we want energy, when we need energy here in Texas, we can't discriminate against any source.
But should we be investing tax dollars into a product that at best performs at 45% of nameplate capacity like wind and solar does, at best 45%, when thermal generation provides at 98% of nameplate capacity at peak? Why would we invest taxpayer dollars or something that doesn't even work halfway?
Jared, I don't think you understand. What I'm saying here is we're not doing that. All we're going to do is if wind and solar and other renewables can become fully dispatchable and can certify that, then they would qualify. It's an incentive to those renewable sources to become reliable sources of energy. This is the future. You know, if you're against this, you're on the wrong side of history.
But the PCM is a very complicated structure that we're having to put into place to make up for the wind and solar deficiencies in the grid. And isn't that the incentive that we're really debating, not just handing out tax dollars to renewables, but the PCM is the actual incentive that is built in for thermal or any kind of dispatchable generation that can perform when needed. What this would allow, this amendment, the way that I read it, sir, it says that property used for intermittent power generation to supply power to the grid, we're talking about wind and solar here, correct?
No. Well, this is just the definition that you're talking of a project, of a property. Under the bill, it still has to be dispatchable, and that's the magic word. It has to be dispatchable. We're not there yet. There's not a project that I know of right now that would qualify under this criteria. But 4 years from now, 5 years from now, there will be in all probability. And so we need to prepare for the future. You've got to understand, this is all about the future. It's about your children, your grandchildren being able to have enough power to turn the lights on in their home. We don't know where that power is going to come from, but this won't create it, but it will certainly help. And it will drive down the cost of electricity for the consumers here in Texas. So let's put aside all the special interests that are involved here, and let's for once do what's in the best interest of the people, the citizens of Texas.
Thank you for entertaining my question, sir. I just have one more question.
Okay.
With this amendment, is it your understanding that wind and solar would fall into HB5 and be allowed to receive taxpayer dollars with your amendment?
Only to the extent that they can certify that they're providing dispatchable power.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. I would move.
Chairman Smithy, do you want me to?
Chair recognizes Representative Hunter to speak against the amendment.
Mr. Speaker. Members, number one, I'll be opposing this amendment. Number two, there was an agreement made with groups on this particular bill. And the third thing is, I want you all to make sure that you understand this is not the renewable versus non-renewable. This is about school districts. This is about business coming to Texas. There is an agreement made. We're going to honor the agreement, and we are helping, for example, the other groups in some other matters. So very short to the point, I'll be asking you to oppose this amendment.
Chair recognizes Representative Vanchia to speak for the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. First thing I want to say at the outset is I really do admire and respect my chairman of State Affairs, who's worked very, very hard to craft legislation that makes sense. I have been a strong supporter of economic development incentive programs during the entirety of my service in the legislature. I was in favor of the predecessor 313 program in 2007, in 2013, in 2019, and in 2021, having even joint authored bills in favor of economic development. And so one of the things we're trying to craft here is a bill that also is going to incent rural economic development, ensure that projects that are dispatchable come online. And that's where Chairman Smithy's amendment, I think, makes a lot of sense. Because the future, as he points out, is going to be one that includes an all-of-the-above approach. It's going to include baseload thermal generation, probably natural gas. It's going to include peaker plants that are powered by natural gas. But it's also going to include about 30,000 megawatts of dispatchable solar that is in the interconnection queue today. The only way that our grid remains reliable is with the solar energy that is coming online over the next 5 to 10 years. Wind is just about tapped out, members. You know, there's only about 5,000 megawatts in the interconnection queue, right? But solar is going to be really the energy source that comes to the rescue, and it will do so with dispatchability as a result of battery storage. And all that Chairman Smithy is trying to do is say, hey, in the future, if you are dispatchable, regardless of what your feedstock is, regardless of what your energy source is, then you should be in the money for this program. Renewables, I hear them decried on the House floor on a regular basis, and it's really confounding to me. Because the prior 313 program in renewable energy has been the most effective rural economic development program in the state of Texas since New Deal electrification. It has driven billions and billions of dollars to rural communities, to rural school districts throughout the state, and it has been our tax dollars that are repatriated back to Texas and put in your rural communities. These are tax dollars, and we bemoan this all the time, that Texas is a donor state of its tax dollars, that we send our money and Alaska gets our money and Arkansas gets our money and Oklahoma gets our money. In this program, we import more tax dollars, your tax dollars, our constituents' tax dollars, than we send out. And guess what? 60% of those tax dollars get invested in your rural communities. I will just underscore how important that has been to economic development, to public education, and to jobs in the communities that you represent. The other thing we need to point out is that, again, Chairman Smithy is saying, regardless of the energy behind the battery, behind the mechanism that makes it dispatchable, you should be able to participate in this program if, in fact, you are dispatchable. We may not be talking about today, but we certainly are talking about the future, and that's a future that is going to rely heavily on solar, as I said earlier, 30,000 megawatts in the interconnection queue, and it's going to rely very heavily on batteries and peakers that are powered by natural gas. Do not exclude one part of the marketplace that disproportionately repatriates tax dollars to this state, and I ask that you support Chairman Smithy's amendment. And if the amendment does go on, I will be voting heartily in favor of this bill.
Mr. Speaker.
Representative Patterson, for what purpose?
I'd like to make a motion to reduce to writing my comments and Chairman Hunter's comments on this amendment.
Members, you heard the motion. Is there objection? Chair is none. The motion is adopted. Members, the amendment is withdrawn. Following amendment, the clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment by Howard.
Chair recognizes Representative Howard to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, this would just reduce the sunset time from 2036 to 2033. I believe it's acceptable to the author, and I move adoption.
Representative Howard sends up an amendment. It is acceptable to the author. Is there any objection? Chair is none. The amendment is adopted. Following amendment, clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment by Gates.
Chair recognizes Representative Gates to explain the amendment.
Yes, members, this amendment is permissive. It allows for a school district to enter into an agreement with a company with an eligible proposed project acceptable to the author. Move passage.
Representative Gates sends up an amendment. It is acceptable to the author. Is there any objection? Chair is none. The amendment is adopted. Following amendment, clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment by Tenderholt.
Chair recognizes Representative Tenderholt to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, this keeps Planned Parenthood, BLM, and
Representative
different
Busey, for what
organizations.
purpose?
Mr. Speaker, I raise a point of order against further consideration of this Tenderholt amendment under Rule 11, Section 2 of the House Rules on the grounds that the amendment is not germane.
Bring the point of order down front, Mr. Busey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, this will clarify the issue that the battery storage will be from thermal sources. I move
Representative Schaefer sends up an amendment. It is acceptable to the author. Is there any objection? Chair hears none. The amendment is adopted. Mr. Turner, for what purpose?
Mr. Speaker, I'd move that the dialogue between Mr. Representative Shine and Representative Smithy on House Bill 5 be reduced to writing and placed in the journal.
Members, you heard the motion. Is there objection? Chair is none. The motion is adopted. Chair recognizes Representative Shine for a motion.
Mr. Speaker, move to reconsider the vote by which amendment number 9 by Schaefer was adopted.
Members, you heard the motion. Is there objection? There is objection. The question is on the motion to reconsider. Vote aye, vote no. The chair recognizes Representative Hunter to speak against the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, members. In this bill, as I've said, we have a lot of agreements with a lot of different groups, and I appreciate everybody's cooperation. Mr. Smithy had put up an amendment, and he graciously pulled it down. We have kind of the opposite amendment from Mr. Schaefer, and I would ask that he pull it down, but if he doesn't, I'm going to ask that we follow the same agreement we did with the other members and that we don't put these amendments on at this time. And again, there are agreements made, and I think this would be the better way to do it. We had a good discussion on the issues of renewables, but I think we should be fair on both sides, so I am officially opposing this amendment.
Does anyone else wish to speak on for or against the amendment? If not, the chair recognizes Representative Schaefer to close on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. Let me just clarify that they were referring to some agreement that was made. I was not party to those conversations. I'm putting my amendment forward independent of those conversations and was not aware of them. My amendment is very simple. It ensures that the batteries that will be subsidized in this bill only apply to thermal generation sources. The bill as written primarily benefits wind and solar because those are primarily the types of projects that benefit from batteries. Batteries are needed when the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining. So if you want subsidies to go to wind and solar, vote against my amendment. If you want us to incentivize more thermal generation, then vote for my amendment. Move passage.
Question occurs on the Schaefer amendment. A record vote has been requested. A record vote is granted. The clerk will ring the bell. Shall Representative Schaefer voting aye and Representative Shine voting nay. Have all voted? There being 20 ayes and 107 nays, the amendment fails. Following amendment, the clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment by Garcia.
Chair recognizes Representative Garcia to speak, to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to thank Representative Hunter for giving me the opportunity to hold the discussion with him to introduce my amendment. The goal of this amendment is to ensure that property tax abatements established by House Bill 5 would, excuse me. Did I just say the wrong thing? I think I just gave my wrong notes. Excuse me, 2 seconds. Speaker, may I hold for 1 second? I grabbed my wrong notes.
Here, I got it. Okay, right here.
Excuse me, forgive me. So all this bill would do was increase transparency. I think that this amendment would also help with ensuring that these companies that are coming to Texas to do business, that they're truly coming to Texas to do business to and increase the economic development of Texas, to include disclosing any type of incentives that they may have been offered by other states. I do believe that this would be a way for us to have transparency in terms of who we're selecting for these lucrative opportunities. Thank you. And with that, please vote yes on this amendment. Thank you. Due to further conversations with Representative Shine, it does appear that my request to ask for that information ahead of time is a violation of confidentiality of these businesses. What we were asking was that when a company chooses the state of Texas, no? Oh, the amendment withdrawn.
The amendment is withdrawn.
The following amendment, the clerk read the amendment.
Amendment by Johnson of Harris.
The chair recognizes Mr. Johnson of Harris to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, this amendment simply offers protection to the new employees that are going to be coming in and making sure that we're providing great wages, because if we're going to be giving great tax breaks, we want to certainly make sure that these corporations are giving the livable wage and the wages that are certainly necessary to make sure that the employees they're bringing in will be able to have a great wage. And so with that, this amendment is acceptable to the author, and I want to thank Chair Shine and Hunter for accepting this amendment. So I move passage.
Amendment to the amendment. Okay.
The following amendment to the amendment, the clerk read the amendment to the amendment.
Amendment by Martinez Fisher.
The chair recognizes Mrs. Martinez Fisher to explain the amendment to the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I want to thank Representative Jarvis Johnson for bringing the original amendment. The intent of that amendment was to increase the amount of salary that is paid to these employees in the direct jobs. This is an amendment to the amendment that makes clear that the salary the scale that we're looking at is the average of the manufacturing jobs that are paid in that county. And so at the end of the day, the wages will increase even more to comport with what wages are being paid for jobs in the manufacturing space. I believe the amendment to the amendment is acceptable to the author of the amendment.
Mr. Martinez Fisher sent an amendment to the amendment. It is acceptable to the author. Objection to the adoption of the amendment. To the amendment. The chair has done. The amendment is adopted. The chair recognizes Mr. Johnson Harris to close on the amendment as amended.
Move passage.
The question occurs on the adoption of the amendment as amended. It is acceptable to the author. The question occurs on the adoption of the amendment as amended. Is there objection? Chair has none. So ordered.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Harrison on the floor of the House. The following amendment, the clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment by Harrison.
The chair recognizes Mr. Harrison to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, this
Mr.
again
Speaker.
may be the most pro-teacher initiative this body considers.
Mr. King, a hand bill for what purpose?
This session.
Mr. Speaker, I raise a point of order against further consideration of the Harrison Amendment under Rule 11, Section 2, as the amendment is not germane.
Please bring your point of order down front. Mr. King of Hemphill raises a point of order against further consideration of the Harrison Amendment, Amendment Number 13 under Rule 11, Section 2, on the grounds that the amendment is not germane. The bill authorized certain agreements to limit the taxable value of certain property developed for specified economic development purposes. The bill requires the comptroller to approve any agreement before it may be approved by a school district board of trustees. The amendment would prohibit the trustees from approving any agreement if less than 50% of its maintenance and operation expenditures in the preceding school year were for the salaries and provide employment benefits to full-time classroom teachers. Mr. Harrison argues that his amendment merely provides a limitation on the discretionary authority conferred on trustees by the bill. The bill requires an applicant, not the school district, to submit the application. The requirement for the comptroller's review is to ensure both that the application satisfies the statutory criteria and that the comptroller has sufficient information to discharge his responsibilities under the school finance law. The amendment relates to matters beyond the scope of the bill, thus it is not germane. Accordingly, the point of order is well taken and sustained.
Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Doorkeeper.
Mr. Speaker, I have a messenger from the Senate at the door of the House.
Admit the messenger.
Mr. Speaker, I'm directed by the Senate to inform the House that the Senate has taken the following action. The Senate has passed the following measures. HB 998, Paul, sponsored by Middleton, relating to the provision of Property Owners Association insurance by the Fair Plan Association in certain areas. HB 1315, Herrero, sponsored by Hinojosa, relating to the creation of the Open Burn Pit Registry Fund and the issuance of specialty license plates to honor members of the United States Armed Forces exposed to the burn pits. Committee substitute. HB 1565, Canales, sponsored by Perry, relating to the functions of the Texas Water Development Board and the continuation of functions of the State Water Implementation Fund for Texas Advisory Committee. HB 2308, Ashby, sponsored by Perry, relating to the nuisance actions and other actions against agricultural operations, amended. HJR 126, Burns, sponsored by Perry, proposing a constitutional amendment protecting the right to engage in farming, ranching, timber production, horticulture, and wildlife management. The Senate has concurred in the House amendments to the following measures. SB 423, 30 yeas, 1 nay. SB 1509, 31 yeas, 0 nays. SB 1523, 31 yeas, 0 nays. The Senate has refused to concur in the House amendments to the following measures and requests the appointment of a conference committee to adjust the differences between the two houses. SB 10, Senate conferees, Huffman, Chair, Campbell, Hinojosa, Colcourse, Nichols. SB 1238, Senate conferees, Nichols, Chair, Johnson, King, Schwartner, Zaffarini. Respectfully, Patsy Spa, Secretary of the Senate.
Thank you, Mr. Schaefer. We appreciate it. Mr. Kraus, thank you, Mr. Kraus. The following amendment, the clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment by Tenderholt.
The chair recognizes Mr. Tenderholt to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, this amendment says companies that are getting these tax breaks need to submit their compliance report annually instead of biannually. I move adoption.
Mr. Tenderholt sends an amendment. The amendment is acceptable. The author's objection to the adoption of the amendment. The chair hears none. The amendment is adopted. The following amendment, the clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment by Schaefer.
The chair recognizes Mr. Schaefer to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, this amendment will ensure that the applicants comply with state law. Move passage.
Mr. Schaefer sends an amendment. The amendment is acceptable. The author's objection to the adoption of the amendment. The chair hears none. The amendment is adopted. The following amendment, the clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment by Martinez Fisher.
The chair recognizes Mr. Martinez Fisher to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I have an amendment to the amendment.
The following amendment to the amendment, the clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment by Martinez Fisher.
The chair recognizes Mr. Martinez Fisher to explain the amendment to the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, this is an amendment that amends my filed amendment to, we're dealing with the area of penalties on the clawback, increases it from 1 time to 2.5 times. And then with regard to the permanent jobs being provided, there will be jobs where there will be an employer-sponsored healthcare plan where the employers will offer and contribute to these plans. And the amendment is acceptable.
Mr. Martinez Fisher sends up an amendment to the amendment. Is acceptable. The author's objection to the adoption of the amendment. The amendment. The chair hears none. The amendment is adopted. The chair recognizes Mr. Martinez Fisher to close on the amendment as amended.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Move adoption.
Mr. Martinez Fisher sends out an amendment. It is acceptable. The author's objection to the adoption of the amendment. The chair hears none. The amendment is adopted. The following amendment, the clerk read the amendment.
Amendment by Wilson.
The chair recognizes Mr. Wilson to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, I know y'all probably been inundated with calls, emails, this, that, and the other. Huge distractions. What is this bill really about? We're hearing it's about corporate welfare. We're hearing about it's green versus not green. We're hearing about winners versus losers. But when I peeled the banana and I looked at this bill, what I realized is this bill is about the potential for good jobs in our district. This bill is about potential for higher level vocational education in our schools. This bill is about infrastructure within our cities and our counties that grossly needs updated, especially when you look at small counties like Milam County that's now prospering from similar efforts. But what this bill is really about, this bill is about property tax relief. So essentially what this amendment does is it ensures the intent of this bill. The language in this amendment makes it clear that when the business starts paying the full school district M&O tax bill after their abatement ends in 10 years, that revenue goes towards, listen here, members, lowering the school district's M&O tax rate, thus lowering the citizens' property tax. We all celebrated when we passed House Bill 3 a couple of sessions ago, when we said no new revenue. Well, that is still in effect with this bill. So everything that is paid in, everything that is paid in by that industry when they purchase that land in their first 10 years is going against our INS bonds. And when it hits year 11, it's no new revenue, and then for sure through the entire period, it is tax compression. It is tax compression. That is no different than what we did with House Bill 3. This just reinsures that it goes in effect more soon than what has been transparent to some of our areas have seen thus far. So, if you vote yes for this amendment, you're voting yes. You're voting yes for property tax relief for our citizens who greatly need it. I move adoption.
Mr. Wilson sends up an amendment. The amendment is acceptable to the author. The objection to the adoption of the amendment. The question occurs on the adoption of the amendment. This is a record vote. The clerk will ring the bell. So Mr. Hunter voting aye, Mr. Wilson voting aye, Mr. Landgraf voting aye, Mr. Shine voting aye, Mr. Meyer voting aye. Ms. Hinojosa voting aye. Ms. Lawson voting aye. Dr. Oliverson voting aye. Have all members voted? There being 135 ayes and 0 nays, the amendment is adopted. The following amendment, the clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment by Hinojosa.
The chair recognizes Ms. Hinojosa to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. We should not be giving corporations tax breaks on the backs of working Texans. And so what my amendment would do is say, for these projects that we are essentially subsidizing by giving these corporations tax breaks, the workers who are working on these construction jobs will be paid what is the prevailing wage, otherwise known as Davis-Bacon wages. This is the gold standard that we use all across this country. In Texas, it is the law. When construction is paid for by the state, when we have public works projects, we are required to pay prevailing wage to ensure that we as the state, as a taxpayer, are not taking advantage of working Texans. All this amendment does is ensure that for these projects, which are also being subsidized by the taxpayer, that we are paying prevailing wage, Davis-Bacon wages, so that we ensure up front that working Texans are paid fairly, that this is not just a trickle-down policy that might maybe benefit working Texans if there's a decision made by employers to pay construction workers right, that we ensure up front that working Texans are paid fairly. And it should be acceptable to the author. I move adoption.
The chair recognizes Mr. Hunter in opposition to the amendment.
Respectfully, I should be opposing this amendment, but thank you, Representative, and I respectfully have to oppose. In this particular bill, we have a lot of the wage formulas in there. It's been workable. The parties have agreed. I'm just going to be asking you to vote no on this amendment.
The chair recognizes Ms. Hinojosa to close on the amendment.
Members, there are provisions in this job for wages, but not for the construction worker jobs. These are these are the Texans that are building these projects, and we must ensure, we're not asking for a handout here. We're asking that they be fairly paid according to prevailing wage standards in the region that the project is built. That is the way we build all public works in this state, in this country, and we should require no less of corporations that are getting these tax breaks. I move adoption.
Ms. Hinojosa sent an amendment. The amendment is not acceptable to the author. A record vote has been requested. The clerk will ring the bell. Show Mr. Hunter voting nay, Mr. Meyer voting nay. Mr. Slayton voting nay. Mr. Shine voting nay. Mr. Landgraf voting nay. Ms. Hinojosa voting aye. Show Mr. Slayton voting nay. Have all members voted? Have all members voted? There being 53 ayes, 86 nays, the amendment fails to adopt. The following amendment, the clerk read the amendment.
Amendment by Slayton.
The chair recognizes Mr. Slayton to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, this amendment is a transparency amendment. The most important group in this bill is the taxpayer. And as this bill's written right now, people have to send notices to the district has to send notices to the comptroller and others. But the taxpayers will have to go find everything on their own on different websites. What this amendment says is only if the school district has websites and social media, only if they have those, they just have to post that they got an application. They don't share any detail of that business or anything. They just are going to alert the public, the people who fund this. They just have to alert them they got one. So if you support this bill, this is a good amendment because the most important people, the taxpayers, are going to be alerted to the application. And I think your people back home, whether you support or oppose this bill, are going to be happy that this transparency is going to be in place with this bill if it passes and becomes law. Thank you.
Mr. Slayton sends an amendment. It is not acceptable to the author. This is a record vote. The clerk will ring the bell. Show Mr. Slayton voting aye, Mr. Shine voting nay, Mr. Metcalf voting, Mr. Meyer voting nay, Mr. Landgraf voting nay, Mr. Hunter voting nay. Show Mr. Wilson voting nay. Have all members voted? There being 8 ayes and 124 nays, the amendment fails to adopt. The chair recognizes Mr. Burrows for a motion.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, I move the House grant permission for the Committee on Calendars to meet while the House is in session today at 5:15 p.m. in room 1W14, Agriculture Museum, to consider a calendar.
Members heard the motion. The objecting chair hears none, so ordered. Following announcement, the clerk read the announcement.
The Committee on Calendars will meet today at 5:15 in room 1W14, Agricultural Museum, in a formal meeting to consider a calendar.
The chair recognizes Mr. Hunter for a motion.
Mr. Speaker, I move to reconsider the vote by which amendment number 15 by Schaefer was adopted.
Members, you heard the motion. Is there objection? There's objection. Record vote has been requested. Record vote has been granted. The clerk will ring the bell. Show Mr. Hunter voting aye. Mr. Shine voting aye. Mr. Wally voting aye. Have all members voted? There have been 109 ayes and 24 nays. The motion to reconsider prevails. Members, Mr. Schaefer's amendment number 15 is back before the House.
For the employees, and then also applies to the occupation.
A copy.
Mr. Schaefer, we're on your amendment.
Yes, sir. Parliamentary inquiry, Mr. Speaker.
Please state your inquiry.
Okay, so we are on my amendment now.
Yes, sir.
Once I go to the microphone, will I have a chance to speak in favor of my amendment when I'm at the front mic?
You will be recognized on your amendment, Mr. Schaefer.
Okay. Will that be prior to any point of order that's called on the amendment?
The chair's not in control of whether or not the back microphone will be on, and there could be a point of order. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The chair recognizes Mr. Schaefer on the amendment.
Mr. Speaker,
Ms. Weiner, for what purpose?
I raise a point of order under Rule 11, Section 2, that the amendment is not germane.
Please bring your point of order down front. Ms. Weiner raises a point of order against further consideration of the Schaefer Amendment, Amendment number 15 under Rule 11, Section 2, on the grounds the amendment is not germane. The bill authorizes certain agreements to limit the taxable value of a certain property developed by applicants for specified economic development purposes. The amendment would prohibit an applicant from compensating or otherwise providing a monetary benefit in connection with a covered job relating to an activity that would constitute a criminal offense or violate any provision of the Occupations Code. Mr. Schaefer argues that his amendment merely provides a limitation on the eligibility of applicants described by the bill. It is well settled that the major purpose of an amendment determines its germaneness. The purpose of the amendment is to regulate activity by persons under the criminal and occupational laws of this state. The amendment is clearly broader than the scope of the bill and is plainly not germane. Accordingly, the point of order is well taken and sustained. Please excuse Ms. Morales-Shaw because of important business in the motion, and Ms. Morales of Harris is the objection. Chair hears none, so ordered. The chair announces the signing of the following in the presence of the House.
SB 240, SB 664, SB 1004, SB 1115, SB 1207, SB 1372, SB 1730, SB 1859, SB 2232, SB 2233, SB 2284.
Any member wish to speak for or against on the bill? Seeing none, the chair recognizes Mr. Hunter to close.
Move passage.
The question occurs on passage to engrossment of HB5. It's a record vote. The clerk will ring the bell. Show Mr. Hunter voting aye. Show Mr. Shine voting aye. Mr. Meyer voting aye. Mr. Schaefer voting nay. Ms. Flores voting nay. Ms. Hinojosa voting nay. Mr. Harris of Anderson voting aye. Show the speaker voting aye. Show Mr. Metcalf voting aye. Have all members voted? There being 118 ayes and 22 nays, HB5 is passed the engrossment.